I do hope you can see me today from where you are.
Ich bin ein Ehrlich.
If I'm generally anything, I guess I'm generally miserable. This modern world of science and invention is of particular interest to women.
The people, I would say, there is no patent. Would you patent the sun?
I regard myself as a soldier, though a soldier of peace.
Welcome to the Biographers.
And I was like, that's true. That's what it's about. Because his friend, by the end of it, who's this effervescent, crazy guy.
Don't remind me.
Okay.
Thomas Hayden Church, I think.
Yeah, he got nominated for an Academy Award for that one. But anyways, you should watch it again. It's great and hilarious and poignant.
I think I had that on DVD from buying like 4 for $20 at Blockbuster in the bargain bins in the end of the day.
I hope it's not a forgotten movie because
I don't think
it's
it is.
So good.
I think that movies that because it definitely won like original screenplay or something, or maybe he won for best.
Yeah. He did not. I was really sad to find that Paul Giamatti has not won an Academy Award ever.
So did Gary Oldman ever win an Academy Award either?
That I don't.
So I mean, it's like those people are like treasures of the silver screen.
It's like I feel like eventually the Academy's going to throw him a bone, sort of like they did with Leo and The Revenant. It's like, sorry, Leo, your performance in The Revenant was good, but it wasn't like holy crap good. But I think it was the Academy going, dude, you've done so many great movies.
That movie was incredibly shocking. He lived inside a bear.
I mean, sure. It was good. I liked it.
I mean, also, he was like the only one on screen for most of the movie, so it was all him.
Again, it was very good, but it was mostly him going, like, that was half of his performance.
That's a big difference from, like, let's say, being Jack Dawson in Titanic. No. He's got a big range.
Hey, no, again... It's one of those where like...
No, I know what you mean. Like Meryl Streep wins every Academy Award, and then there's some actors out there who just kind of like, they just get missed. Like, because the year that they're nominated, there's so many amazing people that are nominated, and you can't have more than one winner.
True.
And so it happens that way sometimes. True. Anyway, okay. What we're talking about Abigail Adams today.
Yes, we are.
Who was in ways trapped in her duty to her husband and our nation.
Yes, I can see that.
I don't know, I have to segue. Okay, well, this will be our final episode on Abigail Adams, so welcome to the Biographers.
Woo!
We will wrap up Abigail Adams, and it's going to be kind of like Maple Dodge, where we kind of cover a long span.
Portion of her later life.
Well, part of this... is because, well, I don't want to say, but you'll kind of, we'll go through it, and she's older, so she's like become the grandmother now.
Yeah,
like
slowing down a little bit.
Yeah, stuff changes. Like
Time
the
to chill.
younger generations are more of the doers, and she's more of an advisor, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, I can see that.
Actually, I just thought of that. So yeah, she's more of a maternal advisor. Okay. She's still doing her own stuff, but like all her kids and people are doing stuff.
By the way, really quickly, I did scour through the musical lyrics, and 1776 does not have any song about Abigail's pins.
What?
I know.
Those jerks.
I mean, I looked. I could be wrong. Somebody prove me wrong. You can send us an email, thebiographerspodcast@gmail.com.
Well, that just goes to show you don't read everything you believe on the internet, because I came across that and I was like, oh, cool fact. And then like I was trying to look at like 1776, but then it was like all these YouTube videos of like and I was like, I don't have time for this stuff.
I went on Spotify and I went song
you
by
pulled up
song,
the lyrics.
and then I read through the lyrics, and I'm like, I'm not seeing anything about pins.
Was it
or
a
Abigail's
line
pins.
about the pins, or was it a whole song? I can't remember now.
Well, that's what I was looking for. Is I was even looking for just like a mention of it, and be like something like Abigail's pins, and then moving on.
Well, I don't know.
I didn't see it anywhere. So
alas. Maybe someone should write that and put it on their TikTok channel. Okay, cool. Well, let's begin our final episode on Abigail Adams, a founding mother of the United States. When we left off, Abigail's husband had just been sworn in as the second president of the United States. Sadly, no one from his family was able to attend his inauguration. There were various reasons, but Abigail was not able to attend for a really sad reason. John's mother, Susanna Hall, had fallen ill that spring, and Abigail could not leave her behind to travel to Philadelphia. John was sworn in on March 4th, which is my dad's birthday, 1797, but he wasn't born that year.
I was going to say, he's old.
And on April 21st, his mother died in Abigail's arms at the age of 97.
Oh.
I've linked Susanna's obituary on our website. I found a couple of obituaries in all this research. It was kind of fun.
Cool.
And I wanted to read this one part of it. It was talking about her second marriage after John's father had passed. I just thought it was kind of funny. After continuing into widowhood until her children were agreeably settled in life, grown up, she consented to alter her state by accepting the addresses of a worthy gentleman by the name of Hall as the companion and friend of her declining age, with whom she lived happily a few years, when he was also taken from her by death. But I love the way they wrote that, because she consented to alter her state of being a single widow back to a married woman.
Yeah.
I just thought that was really funny.
It's like she's giving up her widowhood or something in their eyes.
She was. Oh man, it made me chuckle. And remember, like, when Abigail left to go join John in Europe, and she was like, "Oh, this is the last you'll ever see of me." But, you know, in the end, as she aged and they were together and John was traveling so much, like, they became closer and closer. And so she had to stay.
Sure.
But John obviously had no choice but to go and be sworn in as president.
I like how they said at the end, was it departs her by death?
He was also taken from her by death.
From her by death.
And then you see,
a very weird way to put that.
With the sickle and like
Yeah.
death. Oh, okay. We're laughing about death. But she lived to be 97, so
Whoa.
she did okay.
For that time, that's insane.
That's insane. She outlived 2 husbands. Okay. After the funeral, Abigail headed to Philadelphia by way of East Chester, New York, where her daughter Nabby and her husband Colonel William Smith were living with their children. Colonel Smith had made some bad investments and was lucky to have stayed out of debtor's prison at this point. Many young men of the time had lost big when a speculative bubble burst, including cousins of Abigail herself. Abigail commented, "Such is the folly and madness of speculation and extravagance." Often they would have a windfall and then they would spend everything and be broke all too soon. Despite this commentary, Abigail herself continued to invest in bonds. But I do want to note, by the end of her life, she had sold all her government bonds and she did become a more conservative investor toward the end. So there were no bonds to be sold that were in the government securities that she had made so much money on.
I was going to say,
by the time
imagine
she died.
was probably like at that point just like, let's retire.
Yeah, in the end, she had some bonds in some banks and some toll company shares. Like there were toll bridges and they would have it anyway. But we'll talk about that more.
I guess that makes sense, but it's that far back.
She was a troll. She was keeping people from crossing the no anyway. But
gotta pay the troll toll.
Yes. Well, after visiting Nabby, Abigail zipped over to New York City to see her son Charles, his wife Sally, and their 1-year-old daughter Susanna. She and John had been worried about Charles over the years. If you recall from a previous episode, I mentioned that Charles and Thomas had been in a riot at Harvard's Thanksgiving banquet one year.
Food fight.
Yeah, they'd been fined for that. I did a little more digging around this, and it turns out it wasn't just a riot. Charles was streaking across Harvard Yard with his friends. I also found out that at one point when Charles was younger and not yet married, he'd been living with a man that was rumored to be gay. There's not much on all of this, but Charles's subsequent alcohol abuse had been causing concern for Abigail, who had at times said it appeared he was not at peace with himself. So that's interesting. But as you can imagine, she was pleased to see that things were going well and they were living prettily but frugally, as she put it. They were living well, but not spending too much money. So they'd been worried about him. He maybe had some demons, not really sure. Things seemed to be okay at the time.
It also makes me wonder, it's like, if he was, let's just imagine and speculate wildly for a second, let's say he was actually gay. And, I mean, obviously at that point in time, you couldn't really do that openly. So if that was something that he had to, hide from everybody for his whole life, I can imagine that would be pretty rough.
It's a mystery of history.
Mystery of history. Oh, that's a good one.
Abigail continued on to Philadelphia, and 25 miles outside of town, she saw John's carriage because he rode out to meet her. They had an early dinner before making it to Philadelphia at sunset. Everyone was so excited to meet the wife of the president that the next few days were spent receiving callers, and Abigail had to wake up at 5 a.m. just to get any time to herself. She's like getting up really early so she could just have a minute. A few months later, Abigail had to suffer through the extravagant and expensive Independence Day celebration that George Washington had started as a tradition. She gave a rare criticism of old GW, saying he never should have started this annual celebration because now there was a costly precedent set for his successors.
I assume this is the 4th of July?
Yeah, like he started having a 4th of July celebration, and he made like a big party about it. And so then it's like John becomes president, and it's like, you're going to do the party, right?
You're going to one up him, aren't you?
And Abigail's like, oh, I don't want to do this party. So she had to do it.
It's funny.
At the end of July, Abigail and John headed back to Quincy for the summer holiday. I will point out that, yes, part of Braintree did become Quincy in 1792.
All right.
And it was named after Abigail's grandfather, Colonel John Quincy. So you'd asked about that in the first episode, and I was like, I don't know, it kind of just happened. And there were a couple things where, like, later we're going to talk about where Nabby and her husband moved, and it was like, it was called Smith Valley, and then it was Lebanon. And he doesn't acknowledge that these changes happened. Like, it's not like what used to be called Smith Valley was now Lebanon. It was just like they're referring to the same place as the new name with no reason
or rhyme, basically.
Well, yeah, no like marcation saying this is when it happened. So I was like, wait a second, Quincy. Okay. And so then I found something of the records of Quincy saying that it wasn't all of Braintree turned to Quincy. It was like a part was kind of like annexed into its own town.
Gotcha.
Anyway. So that, yes, Quincy, of the Quincy's, the same Quincy's.
And their motto now, I think when I Wikipedia'd it, is that it's the birthplace of presidents, even though 2 presidents have been born there.
Well, but I mean, that's like a lot. There's only 2 or 3 presidential father-son.
GW. GW Bush.
Yeah, and Roosevelt's.
Oh, yeah, but
wait, are they?
They're not in direct succession. They're just part of the same family.
Well, they're not in. Are they not father-son? I don't know.
No. FDR is not the son of Teddy Roosevelt.
Okay.
I want to say it was like his uncle.
Okay,
or
family.
like
okay,
that.
familial,
Something like
presidential, whatever, and then the Adamses. As far as
it's like
can recall.
similar to the Kennedys, except probably a little bit more spaced out. I'm pretty sure, but I could be wrong about this. I could be talking right out of my butt.
Well, anyway, there's only 3 that I know of repeated presidential names, and they were related. How they were related, I don't know.
Gotcha.
Unless I'm forgetting somebody. There's not like a second Lincoln that we
I can't remember, honestly, no.
Okay. So Abigail picked up Nabby and her children on the way back to Quincy. Nabby's husband was off in Detroit, which I was surprised to find out was founded in 1701.
Oh.
I was like,
wow.
Detroit?
That's
but that
way older
Detroit,
than I thought it would have been.
Same Detroit. Apparently it was founded with like 100 people or something. I don't know, but Detroit.
That's crazy.
He was out on his way to Detroit on another what Abigail had coined as an ideal scheme. So he has had a history so far and will continue to be like, I'll go to Europe and get money and then buy bonds here, and then it blows up in his face. So he's got all these ideal schemes, not ideal. Like she's
gotcha.
She's like he's trying his best, I guess you could say. Anyway, Abigail wasn't too frustrated because it gave her the chance to have Nabby and her grandchildren home with her at Quincy. Nabby's sons, William and John, lived with their great aunt Elizabeth Peabody and were enrolled in Reverend Peabody's Atkinson Academy. If we remember, Elizabeth's first husband, Reverend Shaw, had died, and she remarried Reverend Peabody, and he was a reverend and had a school named Atkinson Academy where he accepted girls as well.
And he was like a super good guy from what I remember,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, because she was like, you can't marry me unless I can keep all of my pre-marriage assets in its own estate for my children upon my death. And he was like, sure, sounds good.
Yep.
So not a bad dude. Later, he does fall on a little bit of a debt problem, but we'll talk about that later.
Cool.
But not like a bad guy. Everybody had debt problems at this time because it was like crazy. Let's see. Okay, so Nabby's 2 sons were described as a pair of colts running wild and needed to learn some obedience. Only 2 months later, Aunt Elizabeth reported that the boys were much more respectful than they were. Spaced from their father and living with their loving but firm great aunt had done them a little bit of good. Around this time, Abigail and John received a letter from John Quincy, off in Europe on diplomatic business, that he had married a young London socialite named Catherine Louisa Johnson. Her family was supposedly wealthy. Her father had been a successful merchant, but it turns out he'd lost his fortune. He promised John Quincy a dowry of $500 that John Quincy never got.
Ooh, that's not good.
The couple had been engaged for a year, but I'm going to say JQ sometimes because I was just so tired of John Quincy.
JQ's fun.
JQ, GW and JQ. JQ hadn't wanted to marry until he could support the two of them on his own. Soon after they married, John Quincy learned that his brother, Charles, whom he'd entrusted with a $2,000 investment, had lost all of his money. Ooh. Abigail learned of his son's mismanagement of her other son's funds, and she wrote to John Quincy to recommend that he fire his brother and hire his great uncle Cotton Tufts as his investment manager.
Cotton Tufts strikes again.
Yes, Cotton Tufts. Despite the loss, John Quincy was doing all right, as he'd been recently promoted and his salary was doubled to $9,000. Upon his father taking office, he was sent to Prussia. Sadly, on their way to Prussia, John Quincy's new wife, Louisa, suffered her first miscarriage.
Oh,
she had a couple.
That's sad.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little politicsy history stuff here. The XYZ affair was a diplomatic incident between the United States and France that happened during John's presidency in 1797. It stemmed from tensions between the two countries following the signing of the Jay Treaty between the U.S. and Britain, which angered the French government. So they had a treaty between the U.S. and Britain, and France was like, whoa, whoa, whoa.
I thought we were homies.
Uh-huh. In response, France began seizing American ships that were trading with Britain.
Oh.
To resolve the dispute, John sent diplomats to France. But upon arrival, they were met by French agents identified only as X, Y, and Z, who demanded bribes in order to begin negotiations.
Interesting.
This led to public outcry in the U.S., and there was a famous slogan called "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute," and it meant we'll pay for defense, but we're not going to pay a bribe.
Interesting. Now, you might not know the answer to this, because I can't remember. Would the French Revolution have been in full swing at this point, or was that a couple years out?
I think it was a couple years out.
Okay.
Right now,
I can't remember.
this escalated into an undeclared naval war known as the Quasi-War between the U.S. and France.
Yeah, because I'd be surprised if they were in the thick of the French Revolution and they were organized enough to be like, let's stop the trading ships. But France had been in discord for many, many years. And yes, over the next couple of years, the revolution will be happening, and then John Quincy's over there while a lot of stuff is happening. Oh, okay.
I did kind of skim over a lot of this because I found that
it's really dense.
we're talking about Abigail, and we're not necessarily talking about at that point, John was no longer the president when the French Revolution was occurring, and John Quincy was over there as a diplomat, and I just didn't get too far into all of it.
Yeah,
and
that makes sense.
I all but totally blow over the War of 1812 because I just...
If it doesn't have much to do with Abigail, then it's fine.
The things that were fretting, or that she was fretting over, were more at home.
Gotcha.
So that was where because I started going down that, and I was like, this is boring stuff. And it's all stuff that we all learned once before. Anyway. So, undeclared naval war known as the Quasi-War between U.S. and France. Abigail commented to her sister, this is why this is relevant, that she was alarmed for John's safety because he was receiving death threats over trying to use diplomacy.
Whoa.
In addition to worrying about John, Abigail had her father's former slave, Phoebe Abdi, to worry about. Phoebe's husband, William, had become ill, and she herself was no spring chicken. So when she was exhausting herself, staying up all night, Abigail was getting worried for her. William Abdi died on New Year's Day, 1798, and Abigail considered asking Phoebe to move out of the house that they'd been living in since it was just too large of a house for only Phoebe. But if we remember, Phoebe had a tendency to take in strays, people that didn't have a place to go. And she had a number of black and white people living with her. Abigail said that of all these people, Phoebe will be surrounded as long as there is anything to eat or drink. Though I am willing to assist toward her maintenance, I do not like to support all that she may keep with her.
Oh, so she's like, she knows all these people will come and hang out if she's got some food, but Abigail's like,
yeah,
I don't know if I like the company she keeps.
Yeah, I mean, it was just a lot of Phoebe herself. Like at one point she was able to grow vegetables and take care of things, and she was making ends meet, and it wasn't, basically the only thing that Abigail was doing was providing the home for her to live in.
Okay.
And then like they had her, I don't know, Abigail was sending some like firewood and things like that to help out a little bit. And really Phoebe had taken over this. I don't know if you remember when Abigail's mother was younger, and when Abigail was younger, these people would come and they called them pensioners, and they'd be like, here's some things for you. And Phoebe started doing that, but she didn't have much to give. So Abigail helped her out by giving her a roof over her head, and then sometimes helping a little bit, but not like much financially. And apparently Abigail's father had left Phoebe a little bit of money, like a little bit of a trust. And she was able to live off the interest for a really long time because of Cotton Tufts like managing it. But then toward the end, like they had to dip into the principal and it was like running out. So she, as loving and giving as Phoebe was, she was probably overstretching herself with her charity. And so Abigail was like, ugh, like, she'll basically give away all of her things and then have nothing for herself, and she can't do that. But as far as I can tell, Phoebe was allowed to stay in the house. Later that year, Phoebe was one of only 3 guests at Abigail's Thanksgiving, and Abigail described Phoebe as the only surviving parent I have, because Phoebe was older than her and had cared for her in her youth. So now, speaking of Phoebe and racism and Abigail, we haven't really talked about that yet. I've kind of like mentioned some comments, like she was talking about, oh, well, the immigrants are not the good workers in my house in Philadelphia. Or there was some stuff that she said about the cook on the boat over to Europe, and he was a black man, and she didn't approve. And she said some stuff, but throughout her life, she was a supporter of abolishing slavery, and she did make these negative comments. But like many individuals of her time, she held views that would be considered racially insensitive and prejudiced today by modern standards. But societal attitudes back then about race and ethnicity have evolved significantly over time. And while individuals from past eras may have held beliefs that we consider unacceptable, which this did include Abigail, like for the time, she wasn't like a horrible person.
Sure.
She was kind of on par with the way that people were.
Seems like she was for the most part equality, but still had some pretty deep seated, let's just say racist ideas. Prejudice maybe. But it didn't necessarily make her a full racist person.
She wasn't
who was like hating
a
black
hater.
people or something. Yeah.
She wasn't a hater. And she clearly had a fondness for Phoebe. She entrusted her with her dairy at Peacefield when she bought Peacefield, and she gave her a house to live in, and she cared for her until the end of her life. Mm-hmm. Before Phoebe died almost 15 years later, Phoebe needed round-the-clock care, which was difficult for Abigail to acquire. It was customary for black people at the time to care for black people and for white people to care for white people. Abigail commented that there was only one woman in the town that she trusted with Phoebe that was black. But that woman had a family of her own, and so it was hard to ask her to come and care for Phoebe. So Abigail recognized this woman has her own family. I would like to have her caring for my beloved Phoebe, but like it's not really feasible. Because of this, she rallied her own nieces and her daughter-in-law, Anne, who was Thomas's wife, to care for Phoebe.
Oh.
Abigail visited Phoebe every day, where Phoebe would grab Abigail's hand and ask, "When shall I see you again?" Oh. In the end, Abigail wrote, "I love and respect and venerate her." And that's just regard with great respect, revere. In her last mention of Phoebe, she said in a letter dated September 11th, 1812, that Phoebe was sick and dying, and then there was no mention of Phoebe after that. So we assume she died in September of 1812.
Poor Phoebe.
Poor Phoebe. Phoebe Abdi.
Sweet Phoebe.
And I did jump ahead there. I kind of wrapped up Phoebe's story with Abigail there. So we're back in January of 1798. We didn't jump all the way to 1812. I just took a little leap to kind of wrap up Phoebe.
Side story.
Yes. In January of 1798, Abigail was helping people financially left and right. First, she was paying for Nabby's children, her grandchildren, to attend Atkinson Academy. She was advising her sister Mary and Mary's husband Cranch, I love to say Cranch, on what not to do with some money they had acquired through the sale of a farm. Abigail advised them not to give it to their children, who had all suffered as a result of some bad investments. So their kids weren't doing so well, but Abigail wanted Mary and Cranch to remain financially independent as they aged. But she did buy some law books for Mary's son, William Cranch, to help him out a little bit. In fact, Abigail kept doing so well financially that she was expanding Peacefield. Cotton Tufts agreed that he would oversee the construction. But no one was supposed to tell John so as to surprise him. It was a big deal, though. She was technically spending the money that she'd made on bonds, but money that was legally John's, and doing a massive renovation without telling him.
That feels par for the course of their relationship. It feels like John in the past has generally been very cool with her just kind of having free reign of the finances.
Yes. He wouldn't have been mad because of who he was and how their relationship was. But sadly, someone blew the surprise. Somebody that was from Quincy was like in Philadelphia and asked, hey, how's the expansion at Peacefield going? And John was like,
what?
But Abigail told Mary, the president had a hearty laugh and says he is sorry the surprise was not carried along.
Yeah.
Like, he's like, oh, man.
He's like, oh, shucks, but I'm still stoked about it. That's what it feels like anyways.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty funny, though.
That's awesome.
Okay. Totally random rabbit hole fact stories sidebar thing.
Fun, yay.
Mary and Richard Cranch. They had the son named William, and he went on to be a judge. He had 6 children. One of those children was named Abigail Adams Cranch. It kind of makes me chuckle because none of William's children were actually named after his own parents, but there was a John and an Elizabeth and an Abigail in there, meaning that 3 of their children were named after aunts and uncles, but not their own parents, which kind of makes me chuckle. Okay. Abigail Adams Cranch married William Greenleaf Eliot, who was the grandfather of the American poet T.S. Eliot.
Whoa.
In 1800, there were 5.3 million people in the U.S., and there are 333 million today. So the odds of being related to someone was like much, much higher back then.
Sure.
But that means that Mary and Cranch were the great-great-grandparents of T.S. Eliot.
That's crazy.
But then I also was like overthinking this. You have 16 great-great-grandparents. You have 4 grandparents and 8 great-grandparents and 16 great-great-grandparents.
I'll trust your math on this.
But like, I didn't think about that. I always, because it's like you kind of start running, like if you run up those paths, you kind of lose some.
Right.
Because I was like,
Dilutes
that's kind of weird. But anyway, yeah, they were related to T.S. Eliot.
That's still really cool. And
Okay.
I believe I talked about T.S. Eliot in one of my series.
Yeah,
but
I
can't
thought that
remember
was a reason to bring him up.
Was it that Ian Fleming lived in a house and that T.S. Eliot was living in a thruple in that same
That might be
apartment?
Yeah,
I think
knew
that was
that
what
T.S.
it
Eliot
was.
popped up in here somewhere.
So there we go. There's our Ian Fleming tie-in.
There's a tie. Yep, there it is. Okay, now while we're on the subject of family names, I printed out and I have linked a copy of John and Abigail's family tree. I'm pulling it out for Daniel to see right now. And it's actually only the right side of the family tree. It's not their grandparents and great grandparents. So this was like a huge page, and it's this. You can see it. This crazy thing. And I had to make a lot of annotations on it. So just like bear with me. I'm going to explain what I discovered.
Okay. Yeah, talk to me.
I had to do this because of 2 reasons. 1, the author of my primary source likes to refer to people by various names. He will call Abigail's sister Betsy, Elizabeth, or Mrs. Peabody. It's all the same person. And even though she'd been named Shaw, like before that, like he just, sometimes he'll say Elizabeth, sometimes he'll say Betsy, sometimes he'll say Mrs. Peabody. It's like, it's all the same person. And so I was like, I'm getting a little thrown off. The second reason is the family tradition of people naming people after their relatives, which, I mean, we've all seen. It's happened in my family, probably yours, like not uncommon. Victoria named her daughter Victoria. But in this family, it seems a little bit excessive. In fact, when we consider 5 generations of the family, we're going from Abigail and John's parents to Abigail and John, their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. So 5 levels of the family. There are more than 60 family members, including John and Abigail's siblings and their spouses. And I didn't get into like the sibling spouses' children. I just stayed with John and Abigail's siblings, their spouses, and then all the people that touch the family tree from there.
Okay.
There are at least 12 repeated names on that like grouping of 60 people. And they account for 57 of one of the names of these family members.
Oh my gosh.
Okay. And I broke it down. I did a tally. Okay. There are 3 Susannas and 3 Boylstons. Okay, not so bad. 4 Marys, 4 Elizabeths, 4 Thomases, and 4 Louisas. There are 5 Charleses, Quincy's, Catherines, Williams, and Abigails. And of course, there are 9 Johns.
Yes. I was going to say, there's got to be a lot of Johns.
And I just kept this family tree up like on a tab so I could reference it back, because especially with all the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, I was getting super confused. And then like even some of the servants who were referenced just happened to be named Louisa or something. Like I was like, which one are we talking about? And it's funny because in my Victoria book, they had a family tree in the front of the book. And so I can see why it would be hard to put this in a book. You'd have to take like multiple pages because it's real detailed. But I was like, I got to figure this out.
It's like I just learned that Joel McHale, he wrote a book a while back. It's called Thanks for the Money. And in it, he has a for lack of a better way to describe it, Playboy centerfold. And it's all about how to fight Chevy Chase. Not even kidding, because he and Chevy Chase got into it so many times. Like actual physical altercations.
Like a folding out thing?
Yeah, I have never seen it. I don't know exactly what it looks like, but apparently it got so bad at one point that Joel McHale dislocated Chevy Chase's shoulder.
Okay, well that's a lot.
Yeah, fun times.
Yes, but in order to be able to see this whole family tree, you would have had to have a multi-fold insert page that folds out. Now, all of this made me wonder, how on earth was Abigail's uncle named Cotton Tufts?
Yeah.
Actually, like, I think one of his brothers was named Simon. Like, the rest of them had like pretty normal names, but his father was also Cotton Tufts. So Cotton Tufts was Cotton Tufts Jr., I think. And then Cotton Tufts had a Cotton Tufts Jr. So there's more than one Cotton Tufts, which is kind of fun. But a little more on Cotton Tufts, okay? Because I got into my like genealogy stuff here. Yeah. I found some pretty cool websites about genealogy where people have gone through and figured this out, and it links to the different pages. It's interesting.
I'd be curious to see that.
So I noticed in some reference sites that they referred to Cotton Tufts as Abigail's cousin, and she referred to him as uncle. We've called him Uncle Tufts the whole time, right? He was actually both.
Oh.
Now, it wasn't like incest. Hold on. Cotton Tufts' mother was Abigail's father's sister.
Okay.
Abigail's father's sister was named Abigail Smith, which consequently was Abigail's name before she married John Adams. So Cotton, let me just repeat it because I went off the thing. Cotton Tufts' mother was Abigail's father's sister named Abigail Smith. Cotton Tufts married Abigail's mother's sister, Lucy Quincy.
Okay.
And therefore became Abigail's uncle.
So other side of the family, basically.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Okay.
He was 12 years older than Abigail, and he married Lucy Quincy in 1755, which is when Abigail was only 11. So I'm guessing that she just began to call him uncle rather than cousin.
I mean, I knew in LA a lot of times that would happen with families as well, where it was like, so-and-so's cousin was 20 years older than them and kind of looked after them like they were their nephew, so they would just call him uncle.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, she could have called him either. She could have called him cousin uncle.
That'd be weird, though, I feel like.
Well, it makes me think of the song I'm My Own Grandpa.
I was literally singing that in my head. I was like, I'm my own grandpa.
Now, many, many years ago, when I was 23, I was married to a widow who was pretty as can be. The widow had a grown-up daughter. I could keep going.
Do you think of The Stupids with Tom Arnold and him singing that to the audience?
No, I've never seen that. I've seen other performances of it.
Look, so maybe it's a little bit of nostalgia, but there was a children's book series called The Stupids. I don't know if you remember that, but it was very popular. It was called The Stupids, and it was just very like silly. They made a movie of it with Tom Arnold, and it surprisingly held up when I watched it a few years back.
Okay,
I was like, this is still kind of funny.
I'm gonna have to get my dad to watch that because he and his friend Albert they'll sing this song. Because it's so funny.
So here's one of the jokes from The Stupids that has stuck out in my brain for so long, and to me it's great. So there's a point where Tom Arnold, the whole plot centers around somebody is stealing his trash. Okay, he puts his trash out, and somebody comes and takes it from him, and he's not okay with that. He's like, don't steal my trash. Okay, it's stupid, right? It doesn't make sense. So at night, he stakes out the trash truck, and when he decides he's going to pursue it, he goes, got to get after him. And he looks around his garage, and he looks on the wall, and he sees a bicycle, and he goes, 2 wheels. And he looks at his car, and he goes, 4 wheels. And then he sees some rollerblades, and he goes, 8 wheels. And then you see him rollerblading after the truck. So it's that type of humor. It's very stupid, but it's funny.
Well, I'll have to take a look because that song is always like in. It's been one of those ones that when my dad has his like musical birthday parties, like it always gets sung.
I'm fairly certain in the movie, Tom Arnold's character goes on Jerry Springer, and Jerry Springer's like, what's your deal? And he's like, well, I'm my own grandpa, and then he sings the song.
It's a great song. I mean, it's funny because when you listen to it too, you're like, okay, I'm following. I'm confused.
Yeah, it gets
confused.
so confusing.
Anyway, I have the lyrics here, and I will link the lyrics to the website in case anybody cares. Okay. In the summer of 1798, it was hot, and Abigail said the ride from Philadelphia to Quincy was stifling. She became sick soon after, probably from the ride. She was so sick, though, that she thought she was going to die. She didn't. The first frost wasn't until November, so John waited to head back to Philadelphia again and left Abigail back at Peacefield. And she was grateful, despite being sad that they would be apart. She had to oversee more additions to Peacefield, including a barn and stables.
Sweet.
Abigail and John disagreed over the size and scale of the renovations, and John said, it must not be a monument to foppery.
John's like, keep it down.
Yeah, foppery is excessive concern with one's clothes and appearance.
Foppery?
Foppery.
Wow, that sounds...
I like it.
it's great. It just sounds like weirdly gross, but it's not.
No, I didn't think so. It was foppery. Anyway, Abigail wanted the barn and stables to both be 20 feet tall, and John just wanted the stables to be only 16 feet. The barn could be 20 feet tall. But of course, John went with what Abigail said, as he should. Now, you can't build anything without the tax man coming to get his cut. Abigail was glad to be there in December when the tax man came. Ironically, it was a tax that John had recently had passed to fund the military. One of the assessors commented, it should appear that the president had not the best house in town.
Hey, that's okay.
Abigail commented that unless Peacefield really was Quincy's most expensive address, she would just as soon decline the honor, since such evaluation, of course, meant a higher tax.
Yes.
She said, did the law say that the owner of the house was to be taken into consideration? Peacefield ended up being valued at $2,000, which was $1,000 less than the neighbor's house, which was the finest house in town.
Hey, no, I'm like doing the math on it just from like conversion's sake to where I'm in history, like doing my research right now, which is in the 1850s and like 1870s and whatnot. And it feels like property value is fairly similar.
Yeah. There's another conversion I have later of $9,000 in the year 1809 to now, and that's about $250,000.
Okay, yeah, that sounds about right.
This seems like this is pretty good deal, actually. $2,000 would be a quarter, let's say, of $250,000. So what is that? $75,000, $60,000 ish,
something like that.
So. Man, I wish I could get a mansion with a barn and stables for $60,000 on land.
Well, that was, I'll reveal who I'm researching at the end of this episode, like we normally do. But same thing. There's a point where a piece of property is sold for, I think it was like $7,000, and that equated to like $150,000. Anyway, we can move on.
Yeah, I mean, one of our favorite things is first medical procedures, and second is time value of money conversions. Anyway, all right. In early 1799, the United States was prepping for possible war with France. Though in the past, John had steered clear of nepotism, he took this opportunity to appoint his son-in-law, Nabby's husband, Colonel William Smith, to be the general of the army. And if we remembered, Colonel William Smith had done well in the Revolution. He was a good colonel. But the Senate had to approve this appointment, and Adams' enemies dug up Colonel Smith's bankruptcy and blew his chance at being the general. He was appointed to a lower position, but it was somewhat humiliating for the family. John commented on the fact that George Washington, who'd come out of retirement to help prepare for the possible war, had no children. He said of George Washington, happy to be childless. My children give me more pain than all my enemies.
George Washington didn't have any children? Mm-mm. Legitimate children?
Maybe. He didn't have any with Martha.
Gotcha. Okay.
I don't know. I didn't dig into that, but I knew that he had no children. And
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Weird.
Abigail retorted, I do not consider G.W. at all happier because he has not children. If he has none to give him pain, he has none to give him pleasure. So she's like, yeah, our children are a pain in the butt, but like, I love them and they give me so much joy.
Yeah.
Anyway, there's more children
but
causing...
it feels like she's also kind of saying like, hey, look, I'm not going to be mad at him though, because it's like, if he doesn't have children, that's like, they don't give him the pain or the pleasure. So it's like, it's a wash.
Well, no, she's saying if he has none to give him pain, then he has none to give him pleasure. Like, because he has none that are going to cause him a headache, he doesn't get the joy of having a child.
See, to me, that feels like a zero-sum situation where it's just kind of, 1 minus 1.
Yeah, I don't know. Okay, so all of this planning for war was preemptive. John sent delegates to France to attempt another negotiation, a surprising move after the XYZ affair had failed so miserably. John reported to Abigail from Philadelphia on how the people reacted to this delegation of people. Oh, how they lament Mrs. Adams' presence. If she'd been here, the delegates would never have been named, nor their mission instituted, because everyone was like, John, your wife's not here to tell you not to do this. Abigail was indeed at first surprised at the diplomacy because she probably would have advised against it, but quickly began to call it a master stroke of policy.
Oh, wow.
But remember, she always, whatever John did, she always like amplified and followed and said, this is the way.
Gave him the rah-rah.
Yep. John and Abigail set out on their annual pilgrimage to the capital in October of 1799. They stopped off to see Charles, his wife Sally, and their children. To their dismay, they found that Sally and the children had left Charles and gone to Nabby's house. The signs over the years had been there. Charles was an alcoholic. His drinking and depression had escalated to a breaking point. They don't get into the detail of every single thing, but John denounced him at this meeting, saying, quote, he was a madman possessed of the devil. And Abigail said of her poor daughter-in-law, I pitied her, I grieved, but I could not do more. Also, at this time, John vowed to never see Charles again. It was a promise he kept.
Dang. So it was like a full disownment.
It was getting real bad.
Dang.
The next spring, on Abigail's way back to Quincy, she convinced her daughter-in-law to come with her and bring the grandchildren. So she just, at this point, Charles was off he was estranged, kind of like William, her brother, had been. Okay. And she said, come on, daughter-in-law and grandkids, come with me to Quincy. The year of 1800 was a waiting game. Relations with France were not getting any better, and it was likely that John would not win the election based on these relations failing. But there was some good news on the horizon. John and Abigail were going to move into the new president's house in the new city of Washington, D.C. Ooh. It was not yet called the White House at the time.
The president's house.
It was just the president's house. Washington had been, George Washington had overseen the building of the house, but he didn't actually get to move in. They moved in December, and unfortunately, the house and city were both still really under construction. Like, it was not complete. Yeah. The city was being built on a swamp, which was providing all of its own difficulties. And aside from a few completed government buildings, it was mostly shanties.
And this is strange to me because if I'm not mistaken, I could have sworn I just read this or heard this somewhere, that George Washington was the one that chose D.C. as the site for the Capitol.
I think he did. It just took a really long time to build. It took like 8 years.
I guess it's just weird for me that it's like a Virginia guy like that being like, cool, this swamp will be fine. Like, dude,
Yeah,
there's
I
all this
don't
other
know.
land and all these other places that are like perfect to build on. You're gonna build on a swamp? Like, I don't know. It just is weird
Yeah,
to me.
you're right. It does seem like a kind of an interesting decision if you're like a hometown guy. I don't know, but this is what they were doing.
I wonder if it had there's some logic of him going, man, this is such a great strategic location and this swamp sucks. Let's
So we
get rid
can
of the
fix
swamp.
it. Yeah.
Like, maybe that was part of what it was.
Maybe we'd have to look into that. Well, the good news was at least they set it up on a grid. So remember they talked
There were
about
actual
Boston.
city planning, yeah.
Boston's things were like the cow paths, and it
Yeah.
was like ridiculous. So,
But no cow would make that
yeah,
path.
yeah, no, the cow wouldn't even do that. Anyway, Abigail got to work readying the house with their things, and as she was doing so, she received terrible news.
Oh no.
Her son Charles was dead from alcoholism. She said she was thankful that he'd not done much harm to anyone, and that for his wife and children, his death had been a dispensation of heaven in mercy. I mean, he was just really bad. I'm not surprised there's not a lot of written accounts of like what was going on, because it's the kind of thing that you're like, what are you going to do? Like, they didn't talk about Brother William either. A week later, they learned that John had lost re-election. Abigail said that the loss was her country's, not her husband's, and definitely not her own.
Wait, John Adams only served one term. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that.
And she said, sucks for you, country. Not our loss.
Sucks for you. And then yet it ends up being the president that replaced him that goes up on Mount Rushmore. So our loss.
I didn't think about that. I didn't think about that. She continued, at my age, with my bodily infirmities, I should be happier at Quincy. She's like, I'm happy to go home.
Yeah.
Forget this swamp house.
This swamp house under construction that I'm living in.
She was apprehensive that the Republicans had won over the Federalists, and she said to her sister Mary, if we ever saw a day of darkness for this country, I fear this is one. So she was just worried that the political change, because she was a Federalist, and she's like, oh, I'm worried about the Republicans taking over.
I do find that a little bit hilarious that she's like, we're doomed. Thomas Jefferson is taking over.
Well, remember they were kind of having a little bit of a rift.
I know. It's just, it seems like it's the same story happens today all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing. Part of the reason, though, that she was worried was she said that the Republicans had a severe sense of irreligiosity.
Yeah,
I had to like irreligiosity.
Some of these
they were not
words.
religious.
These old words that sometimes people use were...
John Adams was succeeded by good old Thomas Jefferson, as you just mentioned, but Abigail lamented to Uncle Cotton Tufts that Jefferson, quote, believed religion only as useful as it may be made by a political engine. She was like, he's using religion for politics, but not for the right reasons.
You know about the Jeffersonian Bible, right?
I have heard of it, but I didn't research it.
It's Thomas Jefferson's Bible, where he basically took out any supernatural anything because he wanted to look at it as a pure philosophical piece of literature. So
Interesting. I might want to take a look at
yeah,
that.
we're not going to get into that kind of stuff, but it's an interesting idea.
Yeah. Well, funny enough, and just a little bit too late, they received word that John's delegation to France to negotiate peace had actually ended successfully. It was just a little...
So it was good. This is good. Positive.
Yeah, it was
Okay.
good, but it was too late to save John's presidency
Gotcha.
because the election had already happened. Abigail headed back to Quincy in the winter weather, and John stayed back to wrap things up in D.C. This would be John and Abigail's last separation.
That's good.
It would also end their written correspondence.
Oh,
A
that's
correspondence
not as good.
consisting of more than 12,000 letters spanning 40 years. In Abigail's last letter to John, she said that she wanted to see the list of judges. She was like she was just still helping him run the country till the last minute.
That's awesome.
She wanted her nephew, William Cranch, to be appointed before John left office. In his last letter, John said, I sleep better for having the shutters open, because she wasn't there. And remember when they first got married, she was like, you've got to keep the shutters closed. And he was like, I like to have the shutters open. So just kind of funny that he's like, you're not here, so the shutters are open.
And really quickly before we move on, those were Supreme Court judge seats?
Various different levels.
Oh, just very different level. Okay.
Lots of judges, but
Gotcha.
Some Supreme in a second. We'll talk about one.
Okay.
So before John left office, he made what were called midnight appointments. He was stacking the ranks with loyal Federalists and some family members before leaving office. This would turn out to make Jefferson really mad.
I can only imagine.
Let's be real.
Yes.
Jefferson removed anyone he could and replaced them with a Republican once he took office. This ended the relationship between the two men for a long time. And for the next 3 years, neither John nor Abigail sent or received a letter from their old friend Jefferson. One of these appointments was John Marshall to the position of Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Since judges serve for life, he ended up outlasting the Adams presidency and had significant impact on the United States as a whole. Because of this, John later commented, "My gift of John Marshall to the people of the United States was the proudest act of my life." And I was like, I remember a little of this, but John Marshall played a pivotal role in shaping America. He established judicial review in a landmark decision named Marbury versus Madison, which I think is a name that you're like, I remember that case.
Yeah.
It established the principle of judicial review, empowering the Supreme Court to declare acts of Congress unconstitutional. And it solidified the court's role as a co-equal branch of government and helped balance power among the branches.
Very cool.
So it did. I mean, let's be real. This country was like 2 decades old, barely.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a lot of organizing to do. So
definitely.
he did some stuff with defining indigenous rights, various things. So he was like, when I read the name John Marshall, I was like, I know that guy. Let me look into him a little bit more, because I don't know, alarm went off in my brain of like, I learned about him at some point.
Sure.
But my gift of John Marshall to the people. I like that. I mean, credit where credit's due, right?
Totally.
When John joined Abigail back at Peacefield in March of 1801, they lived happily at home with Louisa Smith, Abigail's late brother William's widow, and their late son Charles's daughter, Susanna, who was only 5 at the time. John had called John Quincy back from Europe. He was afraid that Jefferson would dismiss him anyway once he took office. John Quincy and his wife Louisa came home and brought along their son, whom they'd named George Washington Adams. He was an infant and was the first of their children to survive, as Louisa had suffered 3 miscarriages at this point before he was born. The name George Washington hurt John, and Abigail commented that picking the name George Washington over John was ill-judged and wrong. She said in a letter to her son Thomas, "I am sure your brother had not any intention of wounding the feelings of his father, but I see he has done it." He did name another child John Adams, just not his firstborn son. And it was like, it was kind of a slight, because everyone thinks about, George Washington, and he made the country. And John Adams was like, and I was really important too.
Yeah.
But like all these people, like memories are short. They're like, George Washington, he came out of retirement, and like all this stuff. So
which I don't know much about the policies that he implemented when he was in office, but to me, I always figured George Washington was more of just a figure than an important political leader.
Let's get it started.
Yeah, pretty much. He was like the DJ at the beginning of the party.
Like, let's kick this party off. I'm George Washington. Anyway. So remember how we went back and forth about the terms inoculation and vaccination?
Yes.
And we decided they were interchangeable. And they are, mostly. But back when John, Abigail, and their children had been inoculated against smallpox, it was called inoculation from the Latin term inoculatus, which means to graft by budding, implant. So you could take a part of a plant and you could graft it to a branch to a tree and make so they basically were. Sorry, I just totally messed up that metaphor, but you could cut a cutting from an apple tree and graft it to a different tree, and then it would create its own hybrid apple tree or something like that.
Yeah.
That was the concept. Okay. They would plant the virus in the body, and they would hope it would take, and it would help the people create antibodies. But in 1796, Edward Jenner discovered that the same effect could be taken by using a cowpox virus instead.
Interesting.
It was significantly less risky because it wasn't the human version of the virus, but it was close enough that your body reacted. So you wouldn't get as sick, but you would produce the antibodies.
Right.
Since it came from cows, the method got its own term, vaccination because the Latin word for cow is vaca.
Oh.
And I knew that because of Spanish, because a cow is a vaca.
Didn't know that.
And then if you ever learned about the Spanish explorer, Cabeza de Vaca. Do you remember him? Cabeza de Vaca.
Cabeza de Vaca. No, but
anyway, his name was Head of the Cow. I just
Head of
remember
the Cow.
being a kid in like middle school and learning about Cabeza de Vaca.
No, it's weird. I feel like I remember, Magellan and a bunch of those guys.
Oh,
but
he was another one of them. And I don't know
Cabeza de
too.
Vaca.
And this is maybe I got it in Texas history growing up in Texas. Maybe he like was down more in Texas and you were California, so you were getting different levels of Spanish explorer knowledge. I don't know, but vaca, vaccination.
Very
so then,
cool.
of course, now almost anything like this we call a vaccination, even though it doesn't come from a cow. But that was the difference. It like changed it from literally implanting the live virus in your body to implanting a version of the virus into your body. And because it came from cow, the term became vaccination.
Okay, cool.
So I thought that was really cool. I like etymology. It's interesting.
Yeah, no, that's awesome.
So the reason I bring this up is because before setting sail back home, little George Washington Adams had to be vaccinated. And they were worried about it, but they're like, well, it's better than giving him nothing, because they didn't have time to do the whole inoculation process, because that takes like a month.
Okay.
Abigail and her daughter-in-law, Louisa Catherine, met for the first time in the spring of 1801. And though Abigail was extremely polite to Louisa Catherine, she had a preconceived notion that Louisa was likely spoiled and weak because she'd grown up as a London aristocrat, not a frontierswoman like Abigail Adams. And Louisa had actually picked up on this sentiment through letters that she'd read from Abigail. So like, she was like, I've only met her through letters, but I think she doesn't like me very much. So she said that on her ride to go meet her mother-in-law, she felt a sense of dread approximated that of a prisoner headed to the gallows.
Oh, jeez.
So she was like so afraid to go meet her mother-in-law. After meeting Abigail, Louisa continued to feel inadequate, and she later wrote, "The old gentleman took me a fancy, and he was the only one." John liked me, but my mother-in-law...
That's funny.
Meanwhile, Abigail was supporting her younger son, Thomas, financially, but in secret. He accepted her money and was surprised to learn how much she'd accumulated over the years.
Why did any reason he needed? He was just a bum?
He was a young attorney that was just not...
Okay, he was an attorney.
Yeah, he was just getting started, but he wasn't that young. She kept it all from John, and it was either because she didn't want John to know that she was supporting their 33-year-old son. He was not like 18.
Yeah.
Or she didn't want John to know that she had so much of her own cash on hand.
Ooh,
or maybe both.
Maybe both. It is surprising that a lawyer of 33 years old isn't able to support himself, though.
I mean, I don't know. Times were rough. And he had kids by now, I think. So it was just a lot. I don't know. She was helping her son out.
Sure.
Like families do.
Sure.
John Quincy ran for Massachusetts State Senate a few months after arriving back home, and he won.
Sweet.
He then ran for the U.S. House of Representatives and lost, but was soon promoted from state Senate to U.S. Senate by the Massachusetts legislature, because I guess that to go from state to U.S., you were appointed rather than elected. I don't know.
Interesting.
Anyway, but he became a U.S. senator. Abigail inherited a share of an uncle's estate called Mount Wollaston, along with other nieces and nephews. So her cousins and her cousins and sisters and her inherited part of this estate. And she wanted to buy out the shares of everybody else, and specifically to help her cash-strapped sisters. And she was really, really hoping to do this so she could help her sister Elizabeth that had married Reverend Peabody. Abigail persuaded Peabody to put the proceeds from Elizabeth's share of the sale into a trust for her children from her first marriage to ensure those funds didn't go to Peabody on, at the event of Elizabeth's death. So she was like, hey, Peabody, she's going to get some money that we're doing this for a reason. She also set up a similar trust for the children of her sister, Mary Cranch, and just to secure their future too. Because remember, Mary had sold something and she said, Mary, you and Richard need to keep that money. But in this sale, she's like, let's set up a trust for your children. So she was really involved in the finances and longevity of her family members and trying to make sure, because let's be real. She just was a really badass investor and really good with her finances and money. And everybody else just kind of wasn't. And she was like, let me help you.
Yeah, that's cool.
John Adams needed the money to buy out Abigail's cousins, though, and specifically Cotton Tufts Jr., because he was one of the cousins that had inherited part of this estate. And he needed to sell some stock, and I like the name of this place. He had stock in this mercantile firm called Bird, Savage, and Bird. Like, I don't know why it's not Bird, Bird, Savage, or Savage, Bird, and Bird, or Two Birds and a Savage. Like,
it's like those law commercials. It's like, come over to Lawson and Lawson, and you're like, Lawson, just call it Lawson Law Firm, or whatever. It doesn't have to be two.
Bird, Savage, and Bird. But they were disappointed because apparently Bird, Savage, and Bird had just gone bankrupt, and they lost like $6,000 there. Anyway, so while they thought they had the money to buy out everybody, they kind of didn't. But luckily, John Quincy stepped in with an idea. He would take $7,000 of his own money to buy some land in the cottage where his father had grown up from John. He was able to purchase it for way more than John would have gotten if he'd sold it to like a private buyer.
Okay.
So that way, John Adams was able to get the $7,000 he needed to buy this other estate. And then John Quincy now owned like his grandparents' farm land and everything. So it was kind of like a cool family, like move the money around transaction.
Bit of a win-win.
Yeah, it worked out. So now they had more and more. They have a lot of land at this point. I don't even know at this point how much they have in farms and things, but it worked out. In April of 1804, President Jefferson's daughter, Polly, who we mentioned a couple episodes ago, she died in childbirth. Abigail had cared for Polly when she crossed the Atlantic to join her father in Europe nearly 2 decades earlier. And she reached out to Jefferson to express her condolences and also to mend their strained relationship. And if you remember, Polly was like a little girl and she got there and Abigail like had her for a couple weeks before she had to go on to France.
Yeah,
and
that
Polly's
sounds
like,
familiar.
if I must go, I will. And they bonded in that moment. So when Polly was like in her 20s and died in childbirth, Abigail was sad. Now, despite the exchanges with Jefferson starting cordially, Abigail used this opportunity to address some grievances, pointing out several instances where Jefferson had wronged her husband. Jefferson stood by his actions, and after several letters back and forth, Abigail decided to end the correspondence in a letter in October. She said, we're no longer going to continue this. Abigail didn't tell John about these exchanges at all until 2 months after her final letter. She finally showed him all the letters, and he read her last draft because she would write a draft and then write the actual letter.
Oh,
so this, I don't know if it was like always with like maybe letters to John, but something like this, she would write a draft and then she would copy it into a final version. So she had a draft of what she'd sent him.
Well,
yeah. So John wrote a note on her draft. It wasn't what was sent to him, just a note on the draft that stayed in their home. The whole of this correspondence was begun and conducted without my knowledge or suspicion.
it's like he knew somebody was going to read it in the future.
Maybe. Last evening and this morning, at the desire of Mrs. Adams, I read the whole. I have no remarks to make upon it at this time and in this place. So he read the whole thing and he's like, nothing to say.
No comment.
Didn't know what was happening. Made me chuckle.
That's funny.
In 1805, Mercy Otis Warren published a 3-volume work titled History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution. We haven't heard about Mercy Otis Warren in a bit, but they were definitely kind of estranged in their friendship. The work received favorable reviews, but John and Abigail Adams were not among its fans. Warren's book covered key events and leaders, but she criticized John's centrist views and supported his support of the Alien and Sedition Acts, which she saw as contrary to revolutionary ideas. The work also emphasized the role of women in the revolution and raised concerns about post-revolutionary governance. Do we need to talk about what the Aliens and Sedition Acts were?
Sure.
So basically, it was passed in preparation for an anticipated war with France. It tightened restrictions on foreign-born Americans and limited the speech critical of the government.
Oh,
so that's why she was like, I don't like this because it's a revolution, and that was against the concept of being revolutionary.
I feel like I read somewhere there were like 3 or 4 things that John Adams did, law things that he did.
And this was one.
Yeah, that were like kind of black marks on what happened, on his sort of whatever presidency, but I can't remember what they were.
Well, to go on this, I mean, he was a Federalist. The party advocated strong central government and believed Democratic Republican criticism of Federalist policies was disloyal, and feared that aliens or non-citizens living in the U.S. would sympathize with the French in a war. So it was like kind of a little bit of a xenophobic, I'm afraid of the people who live here that might be on France's side. I don't know. She didn't like it. She called him out. Despite this, it took nearly 2 years for Abigail and John to respond to her written work.
Oof.
And they only did so after Mercy sent an apologetic letter for having not written in so long. And I think it's funny because when Mercy and Abigail first started corresponding, Abigail would be like, oh, pleasantries, and oh, I'm sorry it's been a while. And then Mercy would be like, that's just the stuff you say to everybody. That's nonsense. And then she starts this letter like exactly the same way. So maybe in her older age, she was like, maybe I should like...
She's like, politeness is not the worst thing.
Yes, maybe it's not the worst. Okay, so 4 months later, they actually replied like in full, and in the summer of 1807. And John sent a letter with an itemized list of what he saw as false statements.
Wow.
He said, surely these were mistakes, and suggested she correct them for any and all future edition of the work. Over the course of 16 letters, the exchange became increasingly heated. John accused Mercy of holding a grudge because he hadn't appointed her, gallivanting sons to government positions, and she was bent out of shape about it. She insisted that she had a moral obligation to tell the truth and was proud that she didn't let her affection for the Adamses, cloud her judgment. Abigail largely stayed out of this exchange, probably smartly, but clearly sided with her husband. And afterward, Abigail no longer corresponded with 2 former friends, Mercy Otis Warren and President Jefferson. She's making some enemies as she's getting older.
Yeah.
A year later, when Mercy's husband, James Warren, died, Abigail admitted to her daughter, Nabby, that she regretted not sending a letter of condolence. But she explained, after the injustice she had done your father's character in history, I thought a letter of the kind would appear insincere. But all was not lost. Later that summer, Abigail reflected on the joy of having her entire family, except for one grandchild, together for dinner at Peacefield. The one grandchild was Nabby's son, and he was in New York studying to be, you guessed it, a lawyer.
Thought so.
The family business. The following winter, Nabby's husband, Colonel Smith, completed work on the family's new farmhouse in upstate New York in what was at this point called Smith Valley. And I think his brothers were also having some farms. So the Smiths were up there.
All in the Smith Valley.
Nabby was going to have to take a 140-mile stagecoach ride upstate in the winter to get to him. And Abigail protested. Despite her protests, Colonel Smith came and picked up his wife and daughter, Caroline, to take them north. He was like, well, if you won't come by yourself, I'll come get you.
Dang.
Abigail turned her focus to another child who was causing frustration for her, John Quincy. He'd inherited his father's contrarian streak and had recently been leaning more Republican than Federalist.
Oh, no.
John Quincy supported President Jefferson's embargo with Europe to prevent war. And at first, Abigail was shocked by this policy, but she eventually accepted it, seeing it as a necessary evil. In 1808, Jefferson decided not to run for president again, and John Quincy helped choose the Republican candidate to succeed him. He participated in the Republican caucus, which appalled Abigail, as it seemed he was abandoning his father's party. John Quincy replied, I could wish to please my country. I could wish to please my parents, but my duty I must do. Abigail was impressed with this response because her son was standing up to political bullying. even if it was coming from her.
Wow. That's pretty awesome.
I mean, that's back when you could debate someone and they would be like, oh, I respect your response.
Yes, I don't agree, but you're still intelligent.
Yes. Funny enough, John Quincy actually resigned his Senate seat soon after because he was effectively switching sides from the Federalists to the Republicans, and he was a Federalist senator, and so they were not pleased with him.
Gotcha.
But his strategy paid off. He secured public office again after a new Republican president, James Madison, was elected in 1809. Madison appointed John Quincy as the American minister to St. Petersburg, Russia, with a salary of $9,000, which is almost $250,000 in today's dollars.
Snap.
He brought his wife, Louisa Catherine, their youngest son, Charles. And although Louisa had requested that they brought all of their sons with them, John Quincy decided the elder sons, George and John, should stay with Abigail and John Adams in New England.
Oh, interesting.
So keep the younger son, who's maybe just too young to be in school, bring him with us. The older ones need to stay back and get educated.
Gotcha.
Catherine Louisa was also able to bring her sister, known as Kitty, for companionship. John Quincy received a letter from Nabby's son, William Steuben Smith, asking to join him as his secretary, and John Quincy agreed. Abigail was unhappy about John Quincy's fourth trip to Europe. She was so upset that she didn't go to Charleston to see him off. I should only add to yours in my own agony, she said, echoing her mother-in-law Susanna's sentiment when she crossed the Atlantic.
It's exactly like that.
Abigail told her granddaughter Caroline she believed it was like taking our last leave of him because she was 65 and John was 73. So it was totally her mother-in-law again.
That's funny.
Now, Abigail was aging, but she never backed down from staying in control of what was happening. In a letter to her sister Elizabeth, she wrote, I am really so self-sufficient as to believe I can do it better than any of my family, so I am punished for my self-conceit and vanity. At the same time, she told John Quincy that his father usually submits his letters to the inspection of the old lady for approbation and dissent, though she did note that sometimes he didn't accept her edits.
Right.
So she was still with it, and he would still ask her for her advice, but he wouldn't always take it.
I think it's great.
All right. It took John Quincy and Louisa Catherine 80 days to cross the Atlantic Ocean and Baltic Sea, arriving at the beginning of the Russian winter in St. Petersburg. Yikes. The cost of living in Russia was high due to the expense of getting supplies out there. And Louisa Catherine worried about finances, just as Abigail had when she lived in France, where the cost of servants was excessive in her opinion. John Quincy made sacrifices in Russia, later hoping to cash in for more prestigious government positions. So he was like, I'll go out there and be your satellite diplomat, and then later it'll pay off. I'll get something good. Abigail missed him so much, and she wrote President Madison. Abigail Adams wrote the president asking that John Quincy be removed from his post and called back to Washington. Madison replied that he understood their family dynamics, but would only approve of a recall if John Quincy himself requested it. John Quincy told his mother that while he appreciated the gesture, he intended to stay in Russia.
It's like my mom, she can't help it if we ever go out to a restaurant together. And my one thing is mushrooms. I don't like mushrooms. And if something comes with mushrooms, my mom will be like, oh, let me send that back. I'm like, Mom, stop. I can pick off the mushrooms. She's like, no, I can send it back. Let me find the waitress. Where's the waitress? Excuse me. And she'll call the waitress over and I'll go, no, my mom is being crazy.
She loves you and doesn't want you to have mushrooms.
She's trying to take care of me. But I'm like, Mom, I can handle it. It's just a couple of mushrooms.
Yeah. I just think it's funny. She wrote the president of the United States.
That is really funny.
Yeah. Anyway.
That's another level. My mom's never called the president on my behalf.
She should. No more mushrooms. I mean, wait a second. I like mushrooms. Anyway.
Everybody else does. I'm alone. I know that.
No, I think that mushrooms can be, they're a polarizing vegetable, I think.
It's not the flavor. It's the consistency. It's like you with coconut.
Yeah.
Or nuts.
Yes. Well, Louisa Catherine wrote to Abigail lamenting her dislike for Russia. Not long after they arrived, Abigail found out that John Quincy was being misrepresented in the London press. That was not allowed. He'd successfully negotiated with Alexander I, the Russian emperor, to keep American commerce open, but the newspapers in London suggested otherwise. Abigail received a letter from her son explaining the real situation and decided to publish parts of it in a Boston newspaper to set the record straight. Though her intentions were good, John Quincy was embarrassed, asking her not to publish his correspondence without his permission in the future. She's just trying to do stuff for her kid.
Yeah, it's...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Abigail was known for her boldness and believed she and her sisters were generally more competent than their children. It's a common sentiment among generations.
Yeah.
So for me, whenever my dad corrects me, I just reply, well, you taught me most of everything I know. So if you're questioning how I'm doing this, you're really questioning yourself.
Turn the tables.
Now, Thomas and his wife had lived with Abigail and John at Peacefield for 4 years. They finally moved out with their 3 children into the cottage in Quincy that John Quincy had recently bought from his father. Because of this, Thomas offered to take in John Quincy's 2 sons that had stayed behind while their parents were in Russia. They'd been living with Mary and Richard Cranch. Abigail disagreed with moving the boys, even though Richard was 83 years old. John Quincy believed his younger brother Thomas could take the boys out hunting and fishing and teach them some skills. Abigail preferred that her grandsons stay with the Cranches, thinking her generation could better shape their character. She thought her grandson George had an excessive self-confidence, which she wanted to correct. She, just as she had corrected John Quincy's excessive self-confidence when he was young. Ultimately, Abigail succeeded in keeping her grandsons with her sister and brother-in-law. She also learned around that time that Louisa Catherine was becoming increasingly depressed in Russia. Louisa had asked John Quincy to move back to the United States, and he declined. And that led her to confide in Abigail that she felt she would have had more say in this at all if she had brought a dowry to the marriage. Abigail dismissed this, saying that no dowry of any size would diminish Louisa's duty to promote her husband's honor and reputation. Abigail was so upset by Louisa's attitude that when she learned that Louisa's sister back in the United States had died after delivering a stillborn baby, she didn't even mention it in her letter to Louisa. Instead, she just kind of gave her a talking to.
Jeez.
She sent John Quincy a letter saying, hey, Louisa's sister died. You need to break the news to your wife. But she just kind of had it out on Louisa anyway, and
Dang.
She knew she was going to get some bad news, but she was like, whatever.
Jeez.
She's tough.
Harsh.
By May 1811, Louisa was 7 months pregnant and, having had several miscarriages, was worried that her depression after her sister's death might lead to another miscarriage. Since the baby was due in August, John Quincy and Louisa couldn't travel back to New England safely until the following spring. And especially, they couldn't go with a newborn, so it just wasn't going to happen. This was even though James Madison had just nominated John Quincy to the Supreme Court.
Dang.
But he had to decline because of the presidency. Or the pregnancy, not the presidency, the pregnancy. This was a roller coaster of emotions for Abigail, as she'd hoped John Quincy would come home. Fortunately, the baby was born on August 12th, healthy and strong, and she was named Louisa Catherine after her mother. So we have more Louisas.
Glad it all worked out.
Yes. In the winter of 1811, Abigail learned that her daughter Nabby had had a swelling in her right breast. Nabby, being quiet and reserved, had not want to cause a fuss. She'd been experiencing, quote, an uneasy sensation like burning, sometimes itching, and at times a deep darting pain throughout her breast for more than a year. Ugh. Nabby knew that the only treatment for breast cancer would likely be a mastectomy, and she was reluctant to see a doctor because she was afraid of the surgery. Yeah. Abigail insisted that Nabby come to Quincy at once, but Nabby declined, saying she couldn't travel to Boston without her husband, who had been ill himself. Abigail, unable to persuade her daughter, researched alternative treatments and found a root concoction that had reportedly cured cancer. She sent that recipe to Nabby. Later found out that the man who was miraculously cured of cancer, that had not helped him at all, and he had died. So that was a total not helpful thing.
It's like the whole thing with Steve Jobs.
Yeah, like becoming a vegan or whatever he did.
That was like, yeah, this guy basically had, I don't know who it was, but had some philosophy about how if you just go to nothing but raw, organic, completely blah, 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 that it can do it. And so Steve was like, sure. And then most people in retrospect have said, if you actually got normal treatment, you probably could have lived.
Yeah.
Anyhow.
Well, the following summer, the tumor had caused so much pain that Nabby decided to consult experts near Boston, and she arrived in mid-July. It had been 3.5 years since she'd seen her parents. The doctors initially believed it was not cancer, but an obstructed gland, so they prescribed hemlock pills. Later, they weren't so convinced anymore that it was benign. Nabby's husband, William Smith, wrote to say if they would stop waffling and just perform the surgery, they would determine if it was benign or malignant. In May of that year, Abigail's sister Mary became very ill with pleurisy, which is an inflammation of the chest and lung tissues. Abigail thought her sister might not recover, but by July, Mary had rallied. But she did have a persistent cough and loss of appetite after that.
That was what Ian Fleming had, was pleurisy.
Oh, yes, pleurisy, yes. As Nabby's doctors grew more convinced that she had breast cancer, Nabby reached out to her father's friend, Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a leading researcher, and she was hoping he would say that surgery wasn't necessary. The lump had become harder, and her skin showed redness. Dr. Rush wrote back to John, not Nabby, saying, "You and Mrs. Adams may communicate it gradually in a way that will be less distressing. In 19 cases out of 20, tumors of the breast require surgery. The pain of the operation is much less for her than her fears represent it to be." So they decided to do the surgery.
Okay.
Abigail summoned her son-in-law, Colonel William Smith, to Quincy so that he could be with Nabby for her surgery, but he didn't actually make it in time, and she had her surgery on October 8th. They used laudanum as the anesthetic.
Okay. Must have been a lot of laudanum.
Yeah. John wrote, the operation was 25 minutes in performing and dressing an hour longer. So they lobbed it off and then they sewed her up for an hour.
To put it delicately.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Both John and Abigail called their daughter a heroine, and the doctors agreed the surgery was successful.
Okay.
Sadly, 2 days after Nabby's surgery, Richard Cranch died.
Oh, no.
And it was 2 weeks shy of his 85th birthday. And if you remember, Richard Cranch introduced John and Abigail. Mm-hmm. So this was sad.
Very sad.
Abigail's sister, Elizabeth, noted that in his final hours, Mary Cranch's mind was unstable and deranged. Oh. Abigail visited her sister the day after Cranch's death, saying, we are all in tears, but herself, she shed none. Abigail returned home for lunch midday and came back to find that her sister had died at noon. Ugh. She lamented, if I had known or suspected her change would have been so sudden, painful as the scene would have been, I should have endured it, but I was not permitted to witness it or see her dear living face again. Oh. Elizabeth remarked, in death we may say that they were not divided. Together freed their gentle spirits flew to scenes of immortal bliss. And she also wrote to Abigail, the threefold silken cord is broken. It's like the three sisters.
Oh, that's sad.
But they died hours apart.
That's crazy.
They'd been married for 50 years or something.
That is really, really crazy.
Yeah, it was really sad though. Now, John Quincy's sons had been staying with the Cranches, so they were sent to live with their aunt and uncle, well, their great aunt and uncle, Elizabeth and Reverend Peabody at the Atkinson Academy. By then, John Quincy's son, George, was 10 years old and as stubborn as ever. Abigail recounted a story from the day he left to go to Atkinson Academy. George was carrying a large ceramic jug that was too heavy for him, and Abigail warned him it was too heavy and he would drop it. "Oh no, Grandmama, it is not," he replied. "You will break it, child," she warned. "Oh no, I shall not," he insisted. And then he promptly broke it.
I was waiting for that. I feel like every parent ever was like, yeah, we know.
We know.
We've all been there.
Abigail wrote to him a few days later, offering some sage advice. Never be positive. Remember the broken jug the day you went away. Those who have lived longer in the world than you and have more experience ought to be minded and their judgment submitted to without murmuring. Elizabeth Peabody said that everybody was amused by the story, but George was embarrassed. So So I think the letter came and probably Elizabeth pulls it out and reads it. And then
Yep.
George is like getting red and just like sinking into the chair, like, stop reading this story.
Basically just saying, hey, respect your elders, bro.
Yeah. Abigail continued to write her grandsons consistently, concerned about their handwriting and ability to communicate through letters. So she needed to monitor their progress.
Wait, she was like criticizing their handwriting?
Well, she just was worried about where their handwriting was at their age. And so she was like, and if we remember, before she came to live with the Cranches, even before that, she was living with Nabby, and like their dad is kind of all over the place, like different ideal schemes and elections and building farms. And like Nabby was really reserved. I'm not saying she was a bad mom at all, but I think that she maybe was like, they were two wild colts running around. I think it was just like hard to get them
Hard to
tied
manage.
down and like, here, let's focus on your penmanship.
What's the phrase? Herding chickens?
Yeah, or cats. So any of
Or
those.
herding cats is actually
Or
way-
col- or
I can
wild
herd
colts.
my chickens. The cats,
Wild
no way.
colts too. I mean, yeah. Okay. Despite her fatigue, Abigail wrote to John Quincy with news of Nabby's mastectomy and the deaths of Mary and Richard Cranch. And she also had more bad news. Katherine Johnson, Louisa's mother, had also passed away. The following week, one of Louisa's sisters lost a husband. And to make matters worse, all of Louisa's relatives were asking Abigail to tell everybody what was going on. So Abigail was like, let me tell you this information that really shouldn't be coming from me.
She's the postman of death.
Yes. Or maybe it's that, maybe they were like, here, you tell John, and then John will break it to his wife. Or John Quincy.
Maybe.
I don't know. Given the difficulties of 1811, John Adams found comfort in corresponding with his friend Benjamin Rush, who had talked about the breast cancer stuff. John was 76 and Rush was 65, and Rush was part of the revolution also. He was around. He was another guy that was around. They wrote about their service to their country. John decided to document his financial sacrifices for the common cause, sending Rush a full financial autobiography. It listed his income sources starting from grammar school and his father's payments to Harvard on behalf of him for tuition to stocks in his current portfolio. It is unclear if John showed the autobiography to his wife, but he did exclude her ownership of government securities from it. Despite her investments generating significant returns from them, he didn't want to broadcast that to the world. However, in the autobiography, he admitted that the farms he had insisted on purchasing, despite Abigail's advice to the contrary, had only returned maximum 2% per year.
Oh, wow.
So she
not a
remember
lot.
those farms. She was like, I should only have all the land that I think I could live on. And he's like, no, we need these farms.
Yep.
She's like, they're not going to make any money. So
She was right again.
she was right again. You might recall that Nabby had visited James and Mercy Otis Warren often when she was young. So when Abigail received a letter from Mercy asking about Nabby's condition after the mastectomy, Abigail saw an opportunity to mend their strained relationship. Later that year, she traveled to Plymouth to meet with Mercy and make amends. After returning to Quincy, she received a letter from Mercy asking for any letters or drafts of letters that criticized her. Abigail didn't send those, but she conveyed her intent to renew the friendship by sending Mercy a ring containing locks of hers and John's hair.
Oh, that's right.
A common custom of the time. Mercy Otis Warren died a few years later, and her son reported to Abigail that one of his mother's final requests was, "Tell my dear Mrs. Adams to write me, or very soon see me, else we only meet in heaven."
No.
And I'm just like, I just feel bad for Mercy Otis Warren. Abigail was like, you pissed me off, and then she's like, "My dear Mrs. Adams," and I just kind of makes
still friends.
it kind of makes me sad.
It is sad.
Around the same time, John sought to mend his friendship with Thomas Jefferson by writing him a New Year's Day letter on January 1st, 1812. This renewed correspondence continued until their deaths, both on July 4th, 1826. They both
wow.
died the same day.
On the 4th of July.
On the 4th of July and the 50th anniversary of the 4th of July.
Whoa. I didn't know that. That's a fun history fact.
It is a fun history fact. In the fall of 1812, Nabby was back in upstate New York, experiencing intermittent pains throughout her body. The doctors said it was rheumatism, which her mother had also suffered from. Nabby became bedridden for days at the time with these bouts of rheumatism. Her husband, who'd endured so many failed business ventures and embarrassments for the family, had finally gotten some good news, though. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives.
Hey, right on.
Abigail thought this was great because it would be best for Nabby to travel to Massachusetts while Colonel Smith went to Washington. And Colonel Smith said, no, Nabby needs to stay in upstate New York at the family place that I've built.
Okay.
This made Abigail furious. 2 months later, though, they found out that Nabby said she couldn't even travel due to the pain from her rheumatism. Even if she'd wanted to, or if he had said, yeah, go ahead.
You're the medical person. Can you give me a rheumatism
It's like
idea?
I think it's like rheumatoid arthritis. I think it's like
Okay.
it's arthritis,
Gotcha.
basically. Shortly after this, they discovered that her pain wasn't rheumatism at all. It was a tumor in her other breast that Nabby had kept to herself, and the tumor was aggressive and had spread throughout her entire body.
Okay.
Nabby,
That sucks.
yeah.
That super sucks.
Nabby's daughter Caroline requested that John and Abigail visit them in upstate New York, but sadly, Abigail said she couldn't handle the journey due to her own age and her physical health.
Which, do we have an age check-ish around here?
1812, she was born in 744.
44,
So for 50, 60, she was in her 60s.
She's in her 60s or 70s? Because if she's 44 to that'd be 66 years old in 1800. Right?
Yes, and this was 1812, and so that's 12 more years.
So 78.
That's not right.
That's not right?
She was
66
born in
plus 12?
44. She was 56.
Oh, she's
56.
you're right. You're right.
Yeah.
You're right.
Okay.
You're
Sorry.
right,
I was
you're
like that.
right,
She didn't live that long. That's why I knew.
You're right.
Anyway, so she was
I'm
in her.
very
She was in her
bad with
60s.
math.
I know, and I probably should have known how old she was.
I'm so
'cause
bad with math.
a minute ago I said she was 65, and so she was. This was in like within a couple years.
Gotcha.
Anyway, Nabby's wish was to, quote, come and die in her native place with her parents, as Abigail put it. In early July, Nabby, two of her children, John and Caroline, and her husband's sister, Nancy, traveled to Quincy. The trip took a month and a half because they had to move so slowly to avoid aggravating Nabby's pain. During this time, without Nabby's knowledge, her son, William Steuben Smith, got engaged to Kitty, so John Quincy's sister-in-law.
Okay.
And the rest of the family was really upset because, remember, Kitty came from the family who her dad was a merchant, and they'd lost all the money, and so they were upset that William Steuben Smith was marrying a woman that had no money, because William Steuben Smith himself really didn't have any money. So this was like a thing. They always wanted them to marry up, and they never did. And they were upset about the engagement, so they just didn't tell Nabby about it because they thought she'd be stressed about it too. So she's like dying, and they just didn't mention it to her. When Nabby arrived in Quincy on July 26th, she was immediately taken to bed. The journey had worsened her pain, and only opium brought relief.
Oh, no.
A few days later, Colonel Smith returned to Quincy. Nabby began planning her funeral, choosing a hymn called Longing for Heaven.
Jeez.
She wasn't feeling good.
Yeah. God. Let me start planning for my own death.
Yes.
That's so morbid.
Yeah. When she died on August 15th, 1813, at the age of 48, she was, as reported, in the arms of her husband, her son, her daughter, her father and mother, her husband's two sisters, and two of her nieces. She had a lot of people around her.
Yeah, that's nice, I guess.
Her only regret was not seeing her son, William Steuben, one more time before she died.
Oh,
Over the previous 2 years, Abigail had lost her sister, brother-in-law, two grandchildren, and now her only daughter. She was visibly aging, so much so that a visiting friend didn't recognize her, saying that he was, quote, thunderstruck by the change.
Oh.
Abigail wasn't offended, though. She remarked, I took no exception to your expression of surprise at the vast change time had wrought upon the face of your friend. My faithful mirror had told me the same serious truth long before. I knew.
Oh, man. feel like that's a sentiment all of us that are getting older are starting. I'm noticing the thinner hair up top. I'm noticing the silver hairs in my beard now too. It's a real thing.
The mirrors don't lie. I did see a concoction of like tinctures of like various vitamins and zinc and stuff that you can take, like drink some juice, and it's supposed to help with hair loss and things like that.
I have no shame about it. If I ever wanted to get some plugs at some point, I don't care. Judge me all you want to, people.
I'm just saying, if you wanted to try a preventative route, then I have a nice little list of things that I'm going to probably try, because I've had a lot of shedding in the last couple of years myself.
I was warned by my brother that in my late 20s I would really start to feel the hair loss, and I'm 35 and I'm holding out pretty okay so far. So we'll see what happens.
Well, Abigail wasn't holding out so well, apparently. They were thunderstruck. Anyway, I had a sip of water, so I got a little... By now, Abigail's closest companion was Nabby's daughter, Caroline. Caroline wasn't considered a great beauty, and Abigail was surprised when she was engaged quickly to a wealthy New Yorker named Peter DeWint. Abigail was caught off guard, having no time to get to know Peter, but she thought he must have good sense, saying he was captivated with Caroline, whose beauty could not attract.
It's like...
And to those whose fortune or exceptions he could be no stranger to. But that's like, she's like, oh, I'm so glad you love my not so beautiful granddaughter.
So we talked before we started recording about we're watching The Crown right now, and there's this whole point where Princess Margaret is getting married. And by the way, everybody, if you've not watched The Crown season 1 and 2, the actress who portrays Princess Margaret is gorgeous. I mean, just gorgeous. So I had to Google Princess Margaret, even young Princess Margaret, and I was like, y'all are being very generous. Like very, 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 very generous. A beauty. Well, and it's what made me think of this is that when Princess Margaret eventually gets engaged and then married, the gentleman that she ends up actually marrying comments to one of his friends before he proposes that he's like, oh yeah, I'm thinking about proposing, and his friend goes, I thought you said she had the face of a dog and the something like a really nasty insult, and the guy's like, yeah, I'm just captivated by her. I don't know what it is. It feels really similar.
She doesn't look bad at all to me.
Princess Margaret?
Yeah.
She doesn't look bad, but by comparison to that actress, holy moly, that is a stretch. I'm sorry.
I don't, whatever. Beauty's in the eye. It's all opinions. Okay. Caroline wasn't considered a great beauty, but it worked out for her.
Yeah, it's great.
Now, funny thing here, Peter DeWint, her fiance, didn't ask her father for her hand in marriage. He just went for it. That was not the custom, and it kind of pissed off Colonel Smith.
I bet.
Abigail, though, admired his approach. She said, I cannot condemn the foresight of a gentleman who, feeling the full force of attraction, took care to have as few repellents as possible, being like, don't stop him.
Hey, you and I have talked about this in the past. I asked, even though Kat was 32 or something at the time, and Aaron asked your dad.
No, I know. I just thought it was funny. The other thing, and I didn't put this in here, but I'll mention it. The other thing that was interesting is that she thought it was important for her granddaughter to be like, yes or no, I want to, because she wanted women to have agency.
That's fair.
And so I just thought that was interesting. And then she made an argument to her son-in-law, and she said something about that whole agency thing. And he's like, okay, I'll concede to what your argument here. And it all worked out. Like they got married.
Fair enough.
In April of 1814, John Quincy was appointed as representative of the court of St. James, and his family would be together with John and Thomas crossing the Atlantic to join his mother, his father, and brother Charles in London. Sadly, their daughter, Louisa Catherine, had died of a mystery illness at age 1. So the little girl that came in August of the year before she died.
Poor baby.
She'd never met her brothers, John or Thomas.
Ugh. That's really sad.
I know. I mentioned that Abigail had lost great grandchildren, or grandchildren, and that was one of them.
That's really sad.
John Quincy's job would be the same job as his father had when he had lived in London, the representative to the court of St. James. So he was actually having the exact same job that his father had decades before. With the rambunctious grandsons leaving, Abigail said that she and John were like a tree in the midst of a plain stripped of our branches.
Oh, that's a really apt analogy.
I know, because they're just old and by themselves. They weren't by themselves. They had plenty of family members around.
No, but it's like, it's such a, the weather of time erodes the leaves. You know what I mean? It's a beautiful analogy.
And they're the grandparents, and they're the trunk and the roots, and the branches are gone anyway. Now, given his new role, John Quincy had to reconsider who would be his secretary, as his nephew William Steuben Smith had been unreliable and allegedly accumulated gambling debts. Apparently, he couldn't complete the most basic of tasks as the secretary. So John Quincy was like, "You're out." Now, William Steuben's brother, John Adams Smith, wrote to his uncle John Quincy for the job, but John Quincy said, "I have too sorely felt the evil of nepotism in that political relation to encourage it again under my own consent."
I love it.
Unfortunately for him, Abigail had been lobbying for her grandson to get the job, even writing Dolly Madison to secure her grandson a position in government.
Oh my gosh.
As a result, John Quincy had no choice but to appoint his nephew as his new secretary.
Okay, that kind of sucks. John Quincy was like, all right, let's get rid of this nepotism. It's made me suffer in the past. And Abigail's like,
But the good news is John Adams Smith was good. He wasn't a bad secretary. He did an okay job. With Louisa Catherine taking on the role Abigail had when she was in London, their bond grew stronger, and Abigail offered tips and guidance. So she was like, "Okay, honey, you're doing what I was doing decades ago, so let me tell you what to do." Louisa Catherine even met Queen Charlotte, just as Abigail had decades earlier. Abigail was relieved that her public life was behind her. She wouldn't have wanted to be on display in her 70s as Queen Charlotte had to be.
Wow.
Because she was like, "Oh man, I'm so glad I don't have to receive all these people at my house." Beyond advising her daughter-in-law, Abigail freely shared her knowledge with other women in the family. Having skirted the rules of coverture throughout her life, Abigail supported female family members and friends who needed advice on property matters. For example, she advised Louisa Catherine's sister, whose late husband had only left her $400, which defied the law requiring that a widow receive 1/3 of her husband's estate. Abigail recommended that she contest the will. Similarly, when her sister Elizabeth received proceeds from the sale of wood from her inheritance, so she had land and they were logging the land, Abigail assisted in hiding the proceeds from Elizabeth's second husband, Reverend Peabody. So she made sure that everything came in and went into a special trust account for Elizabeth. This was also because I mentioned earlier, Peabody had run up some debts. And Elizabeth had made a loan to her husband, just no interest, just, "Okay, here's to help you." And he wasn't paying her back. And so Abigail was like, "We're not going to do this again. You're keeping this money."
Gotcha.
Not because he was a bad guy, but because they were married and she was just trying to do the right thing. But
Sure.
Abigail was like, "No." In the winter of 1814 to 1815, Elizabeth Peabody had been suffering from lung weakness. On April 7th, 1815, after reading 2 sermons, because remember, she was the wife of multiple ministers, she took a nap, complaining of a slight sore throat. That night, she woke up in distress, prompting a servant to call a doctor. Elizabeth's husband, Reverend Peabody, and her daughter, Abby, sat with her while she fell back asleep to wait for the doctor. When the doctor arrived, they were shocked to discover that she had died 20 minutes earlier.
Oh, that is super sad.
Abigail had outlived all of her siblings. In a letter to a friend, she wrote that she was, quote, "the only surviving branch of the ancient stock."
Oh.
A few weeks later, after her sister Elizabeth's passing, Elizabeth's children wanted to divide their mother's clothing and furniture among themselves. However, because of the doctrine of coverture, Reverend Peabody's creditors could claim this property.
Oof.
Abigail advised that they sue their stepfather for their mother's belongings to protect them from the creditors. This was socially unacceptable, but it was the only way to secure their mother's assets. So she's just giving legal and financial advice left and right.
It's just it's brutal to hear about too, though, that it's that it had to come to something like that of oh yeah, go ahead and sue your own stepdad to make sure that's. I get it.
Well,
it's just rough.
I think that he couldn't just give it away because the creditors were like, no. But if they put a legal claim on it, then the creditors, like, they had a better claim than the creditors did. I don't know.
Interesting.
But I believe, as far as I could tell, all these people followed her advice.
It's crazy.
I'm not sure if it always worked out, but they definitely took the advice at the very least.
Feels like Abigail should have been a lawyer.
Yeah, I know. Well, she had all these lawyers around her, so she knew what to do. Okay. On Wednesday, December 6th, 1815, Abigail visited her uncle, Cotton Tufts, who was 83 years old. Abigail had made some prophetic statements in her life, and as she left her uncle's home that day, she told John, he is going. Cotton Tufts died that night.
Whoa!
Just after midnight. Despite having no specific illness or symptoms, Abigail sensed that his end was near, reminding her of her own mortality. Jeez. She decided to make a will, while my reason is sound and my mind tranquil. In March of 1817, James Monroe, President Madison's Secretary of State, became president. Monroe asked John Quincy to take over the position of Secretary of State. John Quincy and his family arrived in New York on August 6, 1817, and they went straight to Quincy to see Abigail. She was thrilled to be united with her grandson, saying, I ran to the door, and the first to spring out was John, who, with his former ardor, was around my neck in a moment. George followed half crazy, calling out, "Oh, grandmother! Oh, grandmother!"
Aww.
So super cute.
Super cute.
When John Quincy and Catherine Louisa headed to Washington for John Quincy's new job, they left their children behind at Peacefield. Abigail mentioned having a pleasant Thanksgiving day with 9 of her 14 grandchildren. John Quincy could only return the next summer for vacation for 1 month in September of 1818. Almost as soon as he returned to Washington, Abigail contracted typhus fever.
Oh no!
The doctor. The doctor prescribed that Abigail should not move and forbade her from speaking or being spoken to.
Being spoken to?
He thought that stillness would help her.
Okay.
Abigail managed to remain silent for a few days, but eventually said to John that she was going, and if it was the will of heaven, she was willing. She had no wish to live but for John's sake. To a friend, she remarked, "Dear soul, I am very weak." When the doctor prescribed irritating ointments to create blisters thought to reduce inflammation, which to me almost seems like bloodletting, but with an ointment instead of a leech.
Yeah.
Sounds fun.
Yeah.
Abigail maintained her sense of humor, calling the ointments a present from Dr. Welsh. In addition to keeping her humor, she continued to attend to some business during this time. John was upset, not because Abigail was dying, but because she was in so much pain. After visiting her, he told a friend, "I wish I could lay down beside her and die too. I cannot bear to see her in this state." Abigail died at 1 p.m. on October 28th, 1818, 3 days after her 54th wedding anniversary and just before her 74th birthday. Her one regret was that she couldn't have her family together one more time. I'm like, just thinking about, like, she's in this big house and she's this huge family. She's like, I wish my whole family.
I wish I had a bunch more there. That's super sad.
And of course, her beloved son John Quincy wasn't there. He was out in Washington. Okay, let me get myself together.
Okay, just breathe it out. Just breathe it out. Deep breaths.
In her will, Abigail had written, "I request my son, Thomas B. Adams, to take upon himself the payment of these legacies, and Louisa Catherine Smith will deliver the clothing agreeable to my request." Technically, Abigail could not legally make a will, but she'd done it anyway. And in theory, like, they could have just said, forget it, and done literally nothing with this document. She wanted to ensure that her female relatives, especially those without substantial estates, were taken care of. She distributed more than $4,000 in bank stock, a debt from John Quincy. There was a debt at one point where he'd borrowed money from her, and so it was basically an IOU. So she had that to pass on to someone else for him to pay back instead. And shares in companies managing toll bridges. I told you she got a little less risky, went with the banks and the toll bridges instead. Each granddaughter received between $400 and $750, along with clothing and jewelry. She left the most to Louisa Smith, her late brother William's daughter, who had never married and had become Abigail's closest companion.
Oh.
She'd moved back in with Abigail and John when they returned from Europe. And I think, if I remember correctly, Louisa Smith had been living with them before they went to Europe. And she said, oh no, like she was a little girl. And then they came back and then she moved back in.
That's it's still pretty nice that she had like a good companion like living with her and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Though she didn't give Louisa cash, she awarded her the $1,200 promissory note from John Quincy. So that debt, so that John Quincy would have to pay Louisa back the $1,200.
Not bad.
As well as a share in the Tollbridge Company.
Also not bad.
And some clothes and jewelry. Abigail's sons, John Quincy and Thomas, each received a share of Tollbridge stock as well. She reiterated previous gifts of real estate that she had made to her sons of properties that were left to her by her father and mother. So she'd already given them some real estate in the past. So all they got was Tollbridge stock and like a note that I already gave you this money or this land before. So that's what you get.
Gotcha.
Every other heir listed in her will was a female relative or servant. She divided her stocks, money, clothing, and jewelry very specifically for these female heirs. I have a link to her will on the website, and it's really interesting. She lists every single person, and she says something like, to this person, I want the top half of my pearl drop earrings, because you could separate them, and then the person on the bottom could have the other person could have the pearls, and the top could be diamonds or something.
Sure.
She listed specifically like the silk dress with the blue something.
Sure.
The blah blah made of da-da-da lace. The something with the dots. Like every single girl in the will got specific things. And she really wanted to make sure that they would be able to afford mourning clothes and mourning jewelry as was the custom. So that was part of this. She was like, and then she'd be like, and on top of that, $10 to buy the mourning ring or something like that. So she was like very detailed.
Meticulous.
Yes. Abigail left nothing to her grandsons or nephews.
Wow.
Perhaps because men could make their own way in the world.
Yeah, I kind of get that actually.
And women were in a more vulnerable position. She wanted to ensure that the women in her life had something to rely on, and her will was her way of ensuring that they had some amount of financial security.
That's really cool.
It's interesting because one of the people that she left money to was her daughter-in-law, Louisa Catherine, and she left $150. And then Louisa Catherine was a little bit like, you didn't leave anything to my sons, my three sons who you beloved so much. And Louisa Catherine took part of her $150 and put them in a little small trust for each of her three sons. And so it's funny because by doing that, Abigail gave Louisa Catherine money that she was like, oh no, it should have gone here. But she gave Louisa Catherine the agency to make the decision herself.
Right.
Which was kind of cool.
She's like, in addition to the money, it's like giving them the gift of like some form of social reparation or something like that. It seems like the power, you know,
it was giving her power.
Yeah.
And that was cool. Even though she kind of was like, she was like turning her nose up at her mother-in-law being like, you should have just given this to my sons. But she gave her the gift of being able to give something to her sons, which cool. Otherwise she wouldn't have had. 2 weeks after her death, the promissory note from John Quincy was given to Louisa Smith as directed. Since her sons had followed the terms of the will, it became a legally valid document. And that was despite Abigail technically distributing property that actually belonged to her husband.
Wow.
Now, of course, John Adams had all the other property. It's not like it was everything they had. It was just the stuff that she herself had acquired. But it was really his call as to what to do with it. And I thought that was amazing.
It's crazy. It's very, very controversial for the time, I guess.
Yes. After her death, John was calm and quiet. John Quincy, learning of the news of his mother's death in a letter, wrote his father. He said, "How shall I offer you consolation for your loss when I feel that my own is irreparable?" Oh. He signed the letter, "Your distressed but ever affectionate and dutiful son." John replied, and he said, "To my distressed but ever affectionate and dutiful son." It was super cute. That was the beginning. He said, "Your letter is all and no more than than all that I expected. So he was like, it's all I needed. It's what I expected. This is all that you should have had to do. Never was there a more dutiful son, never a more affectionate mother. Love to your wife. May you never experience her loss. So praise your aged and afflicted father. He was like, hug your wife. I hope you don't lose her ever.
This makes me sad.
I know. I'm like, I'm getting a little
emotional.
teary. Okay. So to wrap up, Abigail Adams was a formidable figure in early American history, known for her intelligence, sharp wit, and progressive views on women's rights. She lived through some of the most pivotal events in American history, including the American Revolution and the founding of the United States. She was a trusted confidant and advisor to her husband, John Adams, who served as the second president of the United States. She was 73 when she died. She'd given birth to 6 children, but outlived 4 of them. Wow. She had 17 grandchildren. She outlived her parents, all 3 of her siblings, her beloved uncle, Cotton Tufts. Although she didn't live to see her son, John Quincy, become president, she did see him develop his own strong character, serve his country abroad, and be appointed to the position of Secretary of State. Abigail remained a resilient and guiding presence for her surviving family members. She worked to ensure the financial security of her female relatives, often circumventing restrictive laws to provide for them. She left behind a legacy of strength, courage, and intellect. Her life and letters continue to inspire those who value equality, family, and a can-do spirit. Her profound impact on her family and the United States of America endures, earning her a revered place in American history. The thing about these biographies is the people die at the end.
I know. And it makes me sad every time.
Sad every time.
And that's kind of what I want from this, to be honest with you, is hopefully our listeners feel the same way. It feels like I'm saying goodbye to a friend that I've known for a while now. You know what I mean?
Abigail was so sassy and smart and confident, and she's like, also, she was doing all of that when she like wasn't allowed to be.
Right. She was just basically like sticking it to the man, so to speak, and being like, I'm going to do what I want. I love it.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, great job. That was insane.
Yeah.
And tons of stuff that I had no idea about. That's awesome. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. She was, she was the character. And there was a ton of stuff that like you have to leave out. Like I would definitely recommend reading My Dearest Friend, the letters between John and Abigail. There's a lot. And if you can go online and find more stuff, be careful. Maybe there's fake stuff about Abigail's pens or something. But I just think that like it's cool that we have this much information, because I just don't think we often get a lot of information about women at that time.
Definitely.
So, thanks to Abigail Adams for being an avid writer and advocate for the ladies. Remember the ladies.
Remember the ladies. Well, awesome. Great job, Aubrey. That is the conclusion of our series on Abigail Adams. Thanks, everybody, for listening. A couple things we should probably talk about and go over. Where to start? I guess, first of all, let's just talk about updates for the podcast. Aubrey, I don't know if you want to give a little infomercial.
Just about hiatus.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go on a bit of a hiatus for maybe a couple series. We're going to bring someone new in. I'll let Daniel talk about that. But just due to stuff in my life, I'm going to take a little bit of a break. I do have the next person I want to cover lined up, and I've got the research in place to get started on that. But I need a little bit more time to be able to do you guys some justice and really dig in and get the right stuff. I don't know, so that you have interesting people to learn about and learn the interesting stuff.
Life happens, people. Life gets busy. Things, we won't go into it on the personal side of it or whatever, but I think you all can understand when life happens, you got to take care of some stuff. So Aubrey's going to take a little break for a little while, but just wanted to let y'all know in case you get to the next episode and you hear a brand new voice and go, what the hell just happened?
I mean, it's the biographers. It's not the two biographers.
That is technically true.
It is the biographers.
That is technically true. So, just want to let all y'all know on a little update there, but I do have somebody else coming in that's going to be on the recording for the next series, which I will announce now for anybody that is curious. We're going to be doing a series on Jack Daniel. Yes, Jack Daniel, the guy, the bourbon maker that you maybe didn't even know was an actual person, and you may have thought it was a brand name like Captain Morgan.
Wait, Captain Morgan wasn't a real person? He probably was.
I don't know. Yeah, don't quote me on that. He might be real. I have no idea. But yes, Jack Daniel, he was an actual real person. And I just have to say that it's been a really fun research project so far. I think you guys will all enjoy it. It's a lot of what you think, but a lot of what you didn't think. And I've learned so many cool, crazy things, and I'm just really excited to get it going on the next series here.
Very exciting.
And then actually, with that as well, we're going to be changing formats slightly, which is that we're going to go to weekly releases now, but we're going to be doing episodes that are about an hour long rather than an hour and a half or 2 hours. So not only have we gotten some feedback from people that are like, hey, this is just really, really long, and if you could break it up into chunks or whatever. So that's kind of the first reason. And then two, I don't know, just it sort of feels better in my mind to be releasing once a week. So anyhow, we're chopping up the series, but it shouldn't all told be taking necessarily any longer than we would normally take on any other series that we recorded in these hour and a half to 2 hour long blocks. But just want to let y'all know, just in case, again, you're going, whoa, these episodes are shorter. They're going to be coming out once a week, and they're going to be about an hour long. Don't quote me on that. Might be 45, might be an hour and 10.
You don't have to wait 2 weeks. You just wait 1 week, and it's good.
Exactly. So yeah, we're going to be doing Jack Daniel. Like I said, I'm super excited, and that's going to be in 2 weeks from the release date here, which I can't remember what the exact day. It's May 11th, I want to say, maybe something like that.
Yeah, that sounds rightish. I can double check.
We don't have to double check. It'll be on the thing. But anyhow, just wanted to give y'all those updates in case anybody was curious as to what was happening.
I looked up something really quick, and I do want to share it.
Yeah, tell me.
Captain Morgan was a real person, and he was a privateer, which
go.
was something that we talked about in this episode or this series, because the privateers were the ones intercepting the vessels.
Yeah. I see.
And
there we go.
Abigail's brother was a privateer.
This is another example of I said I was like Captain Morgan. I was like he might be real. I don't know. That was my epiphany with Jack Daniel, and it was actually my Aunt Carol, who I'll mention in the next episode as well, who made me aware of it. She went to the Jack Daniel distillery and went, oh, this was a guy. He wasn't, this wasn't just made up as like a marketing ploy or whatever. He actually started this entire thing and built the entire business up, and we still know Jack Daniel's distillery today because of him. So I will also say with that, I am not being endorsed by the distillery at all. I've reached out to them a couple times and they have not gotten back to me. I'm not surprised by that.
Maybe.
Hey, whatever. I don't even care. I just think he's an interesting historical figure. But anyway, stay tuned for that. I think it'll be a good time.
Yep.
Anything else?
No, I think that's it.
Sweet. Well, again, thanks everybody for listening. Thank you, Aubrey, on this amazing series on Abigail Adams. Everybody, hope you're doing well out there, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to The Biographers. For more information, please visit thebiographerspodcast.com.